It is an absolute pleasure to welcome welcome back, should I say, this evening, Professor Tim Boson, Professor of Anthropology and History. Many of you may recognise him from other talks that he's given for us, which have ranged in scope and subject from the nature of evil all the way to the arts and crafts movement, with plenty in between. Having held academic posts at a number of UK universities, he's also been a visiting lecturer and research fellow at places such as the Barber Institute of Fine Arts in Birmingham, at Harvard University in the USA, at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and at the Queen's University in Belfast. As the world's been waiting, holding its breath to find out who's going to be the president of the USA, Tim has just been made president of Conservation 50, which does a huge amount of work here in the local area. But I'll let Tim say a little bit more about that when he starts speaking. He's one of the busiest people I think I've ever met, and we're hugely grateful to have his support here in the Cathedral Study Centre. So please do join me by taking yourselves off mute, and I'll send you a little button to press in a second, and join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Professor Tim Boson. Tim, I'm going to add you as a spotlight video so that everybody can see you, and I'm going to put everybody else on mute. Tim, you're going to have to take yourself off mute if that's okay. There we go.
Good evening, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me all right? Yes, they're waving their hands. Good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be Zooming tonight. And can I add my thanks for your attendance? 70 is a fine number. And you're supporting Conservation 50, which we're very grateful for. And of course, the Cathedral. And many thanks to Caroline, who does such an efficient job in organizing these talks. Tonight is a really big event. And I gather something else is going on in America as well. So we'll see what happens. Tonight I'm going to talk about Diocletian, Christianity, and our own St Alban. And what I want to try and investigate tonight through the talk is really why were the Christians persecuted and what it meant to Christianity. And I'm going to be looking at it from the point of view of an anthropologist and a historian, not a theologian. And as you know, there are many interpretations in history of various things. So if you're left with some uncertainty at the end, don't be surprised. Now, we're going to try and do some clever technical things here. I'm going to try and share my screen with you, which will have slides on, but Caroline has to hand over, she's in control. She has to hand over control to me. Caroline, have you handed over control? Yes, she has. Brilliant. And here we go.
Somebody calling, trying to get Zoom support. Sorry, you've got control of the meeting.
We're underway here, yes.
There you go.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I just need to adjust on the screen here. I hope everybody can see that. Sometimes these slides will go a bit slowly, so don't be surprised if I start and you haven't actually got it. It will come to you. So we're going to start off with looking at the Roman Empire and what was the Roman Empire about and how did it operate, which explains partly why it then comes into conflict with Christianity. Now, you're looking at the Roman Empire as it was at its greatest extent in AD 117 under the Emperor Hadrian. And you can see it was a vast empire, one of the biggest the world's ever seen, population, which is of course a very great estimate because they didn't have censuses that have come down to us. We know they did have a census, of course, because Joseph and Mary were going on a census for the empire. But we think about 70 million at this time, and roughly covering almost 1,900,000 square miles. So it's a massive empire, and you can see this was its greatest extent. The darker pinker bits here, this is where Trajan conquered, and you can see he brought Dacia into the empire, and he even conquered what was then part of the Persian Empire in Mesopotamia, though the Romans didn't hold on for very long. And of course, they were also in Britain, although that was prior to Trajan. Of course, it was under the Emperor Claudius. So it was a huge empire. And just imagine the problems of trying to govern and manage an empire in those days when they didn't have modern communications, when it would take several months to travel around the empire. The quickest way, of course, for them was to use ships across the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean was the most important part of their communication. But what was the empire like? Now, excuse this rather busy slide, but I'll take you through it. The Roman Empire, as you probably realize, started off as an oligarchy, the Republic up here. You can see where my cursor is here. And it was replaced in the 1st century, after the assassination of Julius Caesar, by his nephew, adopted son, Augustus. And Augustus became what the Romans called primus inter pares. He became the first amongst equals, and he actually named his rule the Principate. It was that he was, in a sense, the prime person, but not a king and not a dictator, though it was, in fact, very much an autocracy by the time he'd finished his rule. And I'm just fiddling here with my computer. That's good. Got that bit water. Here's a bronze head of him that was found in actually in Sudan. And archaeologists think what happened was that there was a raid from the kingdom of Meroe on Egypt, and they took his head back as a prize, and they buried it in front of one of their temples. So it was almost a bit of head hunting. But of course, that head is now in the British Museum and gives us an idea of what Augustus wanted to look like, because already the imperialistic propaganda was coming out and political opposition was being suppressed. It was very much an autocracy. And what was interesting about it was it behaved in the way that many absolute autocracies behave, and many totalitarian states behave. And I put down your right-hand side there of your screen, these famous photographs of Lenin's speech in Moscow in 1920. And after Stalin came to power, Trotsky and Kamenev were nicely removed. You can see they've just gone. They've just been disappeared because their memories were damned in the same way the Roman Empire operated, because they didn't have the same photographic facilities. So if you look at this bullet point here, damnato memoriae, it can have a surviving example of it here, almost unique. This is a painted roundel, as it's called, from the time of the Emperor Septimius Severus in the 2nd century. And there's Septimius there, and his wife, Julia Domna, and his eldest son, who took on the name of Caracalla, which actually just means cloak, Mr. Cloak, as he was, and then a younger son called Geta. Now, when Septimius Severus died, Caracalla took over, had his brother imprisoned, and then executed. And all the references to Geta were then removed from sculptures, from public references, and this roundel, which was probably in the province, because not only did they scrub his face out here, but they smeared it with excrement. And our modern scientists have been able to tell us that. So he really was damned. And it's the same idea of a dictatorship when your predecessors, you get rid of them if you didn't like them, and so on. So the Romans constantly were damning people who had previously in power or had fallen from power, who they didn't like. But the empire itself was very prescriptive. And although it was polytheistic and it tolerated polytheistic religions, it didn't really like monotheism, because that denied the emperor, and it denied the emperor's own aspirations to be divine. Now, of course, the Romans had conquered Judea and the Jewish people, and there were constant rebellions because of the conflict between the Greek population there and the Judaic population, the Jewish population, who were monotheistic and would not recognize the emperor. I put on here Israel today, which held out against the Romans until finally in 72 AD, the Romans, or rather 74 AD, the Romans captured it, and they built, I don't know if you can see there, but there's a ramp. The Romans built a ramp all the way up and stormed it, but the defenders, the zealots, rather than being captured by the Romans, threw themselves off. Women and children, everybody committed suicide. And Masada's become a bit of a unique piece of propaganda for the Jewish people now. It's a we never submit idea, whatever happens to us. Down below are the Romans in triumph, and this comes from the Arch of Titus, which was built probably about 81 AD, and it shows the triumphal procession, and you may see the menorah there being carried from the Temple of Jerusalem. And of course, it's still marked today, that destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, and the sacred wall, the surviving wall of that temple is very precious to the Jewish people. And I put over here, because it just brings it up to modern day, this is, Chinese would call it a re-education camp for the Uyghur people. And this is another example of a totalitarian state trying to suppress the ideology, the theology of the Uyghur people, who of course are Muslims. And it shows that inclination within absolute totalitarian regimes to suppress other ideologies and thoughts which conflict with their ideas. So it wasn't a very pleasant place to live in, the Roman Empire, if you resisted authority in any way. And you have to remember what sort of society it was. This was the society where criminals were executed, crucified even, and people died for sport in the gladiatorial arena. There were slaves, women were suppressed. It was a pretty tough society. So although we see beautiful sculpture and architecture surviving from that Roman world, it probably wasn't a good place to live unless you were amongst the elite. What happened with Christianity then from the 1st century? Well, this is a map showing the spread of Christianity. And as you can see, the purple area, of course, you wouldn't be surprised that Christianity in its home area developed, because it was seen initially as a sect of Judaism. It was monotheistic, it recognized the Messiah, so it was seen as part of the Jewish tradition of religion. But because of mainly St. Paul, it was then extended, of course, out to non-Jewish people, and it began to grow across the empire. And by the 4th century, by the time of Diocletian, when we come on to Diocletian, you can see we roughly think where it spread. And the main evidence for this is references to mainly bishops and to church people and theologians who were living in these regions. And you see it did get into Britain, particularly strong the east and around the southeast, and what became, of course, the Celtic Church also in South Wales there. So gradual spread of Christianity. So how was Christianity viewed throughout the empire? Well, it was very much a secret cult, a secret sect, and it operated under the radar, if you like, until certain elements brought it forward. We know that, of course, they buried their dead in Rome in the catacombs, and I really like this fresco. This was discovered about 10 years ago in the Catacomb of Priscilla. We can't date it very accurately, but it's between the 2nd and 4th century. But if you look carefully, this is a Eucharist, and can you see that these are women taking part in the Eucharist? This, you may remember, some of you who follow theology may remember, this caused a bit of a storm in the Vatican because, of course, it wasn't considered that women should have been in the early church doing that, but it was quite egalitarian, and we've got quite a lot of evidence that women held official posts in the early church. One of the things that Christians did in terms of their secret cult, in keeping secret, was, of course, they had lots of symbols, but also they used acrostics to declare their Christianity. And this one comes from Ephesus. It's a graffiti, now in modern Turkey, and it's the famous fish, the ichthyos, the Greek for fish. and it's also the acrostic which also reveals Christ's name. And the acrostic works like this down here. You can see iota, chi, theta, upsilon, sigma. And the first iota is the letter of Jesus in Greek, Jesus, Greek for Jesus. Then chi, the first letter of Christos, Christos in Greek, Greek for the anointed of the Lord. Then theta here, the first letter of Theo, Theos, of course, being God. So the Greek for God, the genitive singular of Theos, Theo. And upsilon here is for the letter Huios, Huios, the Greek son. Huios meaning son, so son of God. And finally, sigma, the first letter of Sota in Greek, which means, well, I see R's dropped off there, but that should be Saviour. This is a modern artistic work from Ken Saunders Gallery in Chicago. And you see that fish used still now as a symbol, the ichthyosis. So an acrostic which has declared your Christianity. Imperial policy to Christians is quite interesting, and it's unfortunately for historians very contaminated by later evidence. Now, everybody knows, of course, that the Great Fire of Rome and the Christians were blamed and burnt in the arena. It couldn't have been the Colosseum because it wasn't yet built. But in fact, there's a problem. Our source, the historian Tacitus, the manuscript in which the annals appear and where it says the Christians were blamed and executed, was a later interpolation. So the problem is that that text is probably not authentic. And we'll come on to the reason why later Christian writers wanted to put interpolations into ancient texts, which was all about the tradition of Christianity. So we can't really, I'm afraid, blame the Great Fire of the Christians, and we certainly can't blame Nero really for persecuting the Christians at that time. We're in a similar situation too with the so-called persecutions under the Emperor Domitian. We go down here, Domitian ruling from 89 to 96. It's disputed by modern scholars because, again, we don't have the contemporary evidence. However, we do have some wonderful evidence from Trajan's reign. Here's Trajan, 89 to 117 AD or CE, and the evidence comes from the writer Pliny the Younger. Now, many of you will know about Pliny the Younger because he was a very important source for us, because Pliny the Younger was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, by chance, when Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD. We used to think it was on the 24th of August. We're not so clear now, and it may well have been in the autumn. But we get a wonderful description from Pliny the Younger of the eruption of Vesuvius. Well, Pliny the Younger went on to be a Roman administrator, and he ended up being the governor of Bithynia. Here's Bithynia on the map over here. You see Turkey. Its center was Nicomedia, and it's just across the water, really, from what is now Istanbul. And Pliny writes a letter, and he wrote many letters which have been preserved to the Emperor Trajan, around about 112, seeking advice on what to do about the Christians. You've got these Christians in Nicomedia. It was a strong Christian town, in fact, and they were causing some trouble to him, and he didn't really know what to do. Trajan gives a very short reply, and it's basically, do not seek out the Christians for trial. If the accused are found guilty of being Christian, then they must be punished. So to be a Christian was technically a crime at this time. But it's one of those crimes where you don't seek them out. However, if the accused deny they're Christians and they show proof that they're not by worshipping the ancient gods, then they must be pardoned. And this is interesting as well. Anonymous accusations should not be considered. It would be too easy for you in your neighbor's dispute to say your neighbor was a Christian and get them removed. So it was a crime at this stage under Trajan's law to be a Christian. And the reason was that they were not honoring the ancient gods and they were not worshipping the emperor, because at this stage, the emperor was deified and had a temple, and you were supposed to show your loyalty by worshipping the emperor. It's a bit in the same way. We get used to these totalitarian regimes with autocrats where their image and their sculptures are everywhere and they're really powerful. I immediately think of the Kims in North Korea, where their statues are so grand and they're always there seeking approval of the citizens of North Korea. So the Christians are criminalized, but at the moment they're not being sought out under Trajan. Trajan was followed by Hadrian, who was also tolerant, but interesting enough, during his reign, there was a massive Jewish revolt again, and that was suppressed by the Roman armies. Now, the Jews were treated differently from the Christians, because although they were monotheistic, they were an ethnic group, and they did not try and proselytize outside that group. The problem with the Christians is that they were proselytizing, they were seeking to convert people who were not Christians. And this became a problem with regard to the old religions and the priests within the old religions. The evidence we get then, mainly from church fathers and theologians writing, is that there is sporadic persecution across the provinces, particularly by the provincial governors, but it's not organized in a clear way by the emperors from the state. And we'll come on where the state do start organizing mass persecutions. But there's a lot of anti-Christian propaganda going around, and the imputations are, as you can see here, they're atheistic because they don't worship the polytheistic gods of the ancient world. And you have to remember the Romans were very inclusive in their polytheism. For example, when they came to Britain, they found Celtic gods here. Rather than banning the Celtic gods or saying they weren't gods, they just elided them. So you get simple elisions of Celtic gods being seen as representing or equivalent of classical gods. So, for example, the god Sul at Bath, where you can see the Roman baths, the Sul, the god Sul, got just absorbed into the panoply of the polytheistic gods of Rome. Then the other, this is a classic, isn't it? The stereotypical things that when you want to criminalize and attack some other group, they indulge in incest and infanticide. And infanticide was, again, a classic accusation. Of course, it started, as far as the Romans were concerned, with the Carthaginians and the Punic Wars, where they came up against the Carthaginians, and the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, remember the Carthaginians were a colony of the Phoenicians, were accused of killing their firstborn, and in fact there is evidence that that was actually true. But in the case of the Christians, obviously this was a made-up charge, and they were also accused of cannibalism. Now, this is interesting because I'm illustrating here the so-called Antioch chalice, which is one of our earliest, we think, possibly chalices, although the evidence now is it probably wasn't a chalice at all, but that's another story. Byzantine and in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Now, the Christians, of course, had the Eucharist, and the pagans accused them of drinking the blood of people. So the whole mystery of the Eucharist was then turned against the Christians as proof that they were indulging in cannibalism and infanticide and so on. So lots of accusations started from the pagan side against the Christians, and it probably was because people were converting and the old religions were seeing that they were losing their devotees. On the left-hand side, we have a tombstone of a Christian lady. Now, this is interesting because this was excavated just roughly where the Vatican site was. But the fact that it's a tombstone shows that this person wasn't afraid, in a sense, to declare, though it's done in quite a subtle way, because it's done in Greek, and you've got the ichthos again, and it's zoantion, the living fish. Yet at the same time, you've got dies manibus, which is the pagan to the departed spirits. So you've got the classical bit from the ancient world there with the new, and you've actually got here illustration of two fish and an anchor running across. And here's the inscription. Unfortunately, we lost the bottom part. We've got the inscription to Licinia, Ammias, 3rd century, and it says here, she lived bene merenti, a good life. She had a good life. So there, the Christian family are not frightened to declare, because obviously that would be read as a Christian devotee without actually making it totally clear that they were Christian. I've cheated a bit with this. This is a mosaic from Tripoli in North Africa, and it's about what happens in the amphitheatre, but this is the stereotype of what we think was happening to Christians. They would be thrown, in this case, not to a lion, but a tiger, or a leopard over here, being thrown to the wild animals. This became a classic way of treating criminals for murder or other crimes, serious crimes, rather than having them crucified or executed. It was all for the entertainment, I'm afraid, of people. It's interesting about this element of within humanity about enjoying that sort of suffering. And you have to remember, even in our own culture, right up until the 19th century, people turned up en masse to watch public executions. We have this element in our human behavior where human beings, we gather together to watch these most awful things. It's strange, vicarious emotion that human beings can enjoy violence in that way. And of course, we see violence all the time in our media now. So Christian persecution started slowly, and it was based on a lot of false premises, but because it was undermining the official state religions, therefore the authorities took it seriously. When we move into the 3rd century, we begin to see the reasons why the totalitarian government of the emperors was on the retreat and was looking out for scapegoats, of which the Christians conveniently complied in several ways. In the 3rd century, there's a breakdown, basically, of the Roman government. It's partly because of civil war. The civil war starts because there's no proper imperial succession system. It's not hereditary, although often emperors were followed by their sons. But because it had been set by Augustus as the first amongst equals, it also had to be done in terms of merit. Well, your best merit was to make sure you had the army on your side. And if you were a general, then your army would support you. And during the 3rd century, there are 30 different emperors between 235 and 284, and many of them are put on the throne by the military. So there's not stability within the empire, and that we'll see what happens to the empire because of that lack of stability. At the same time, there are some natural disasters. Well, that could have happened at any time, but in fact, at the end of the 2nd century, plague is brought into the Roman Empire by probably the Roman army itself from campaigning in the east, and the countryside is decimated. There's a big depopulation of the land and a shortage. So the economy of Rome was really suffering. At the same time, there are invasions from two main enemies. One, an organized kingdom under the Sasanian dynasty from Persia, who were constantly raiding the east of the empire. Interesting enough, often what they wanted was money, and what they needed the money for them was to defend their own borders from the north, from invading nomads. One of their famous kings who operated and got right up to Antioch was Shapur I, the Sasanian king, and here's one of his coins with this rather splendid crown. On the northern frontiers, the Germanic tribes were pressing. So you had the Goths, the Alemanni, the Vandals, of course, who give their name for really bad behavior. And eventually, of course, they were to settle in North Africa and destroy a lot of North Africa. The Saxons, who we know well, and many of us are descended from, were all trying to get into the empire. And they, again, were usually after wealth, and in some cases after better land, more fertile land. So the empire was very vulnerable to those invasions. And of course, that had consequences. There was a breakdown of trade, and we can observe it very clearly in the inflation of the currency. Most Roman currency of the lower denominations was based on silver. And what the Romans did was gradually reduce the amount of silver in their coins so that there was a steady inflation. If we start this with Caracalla, Caracalla introduced this coin called the Antoninianus, a silver coin initially, but it soon became a bronze coin with a silver wash. So if you follow this graph, the silver coins, by the time we get down, right down here, virtually no silver at all. During the reign of Claudius Gothicus in 268, 269, here is Claudius Gothicus, his coin, and when these coins turn up either in hoards or on archaeological sites, they usually have no trace of silver left at all. So, of course, the people, traders, the population realized what was going on, and that just pushed the price up of everything. So you've got this mass inflation. So the empire, by the end of the 3rd century, was in crisis for all these different reasons. If we look at the map, it sort of illustrates what's going on and what's happening. If we go to Persia here, you can see these red lines are all Persian invasions, and you can see Antioch, major city, falls to them. In the end, the Persians are pushed back, and you see this yellow area by the kingdom of Palmyra. Now, Palmyra, of course, was sadly in the news because of the destruction that ISIS reaped on it. But Palmyra was on the edge of the desert, and it had a powerful kingdom developed there, which defended the east as a proxy for the Romans. And many of you will know the rather exotic queen, Zenobia. Zenobia's husband, Odenathus, and Zenobia herself defended this area and became very powerful. Eventually, the kingdom was brought back into the empire by the Emperor Aurelian. And there's lots of nice fictional stories about Aurelian taking Zenobia back as a captive queen to Rome and shacking up with her. We'll never know the truth. Over here, you've got the Germanic tribes invading, and you can see they come into what is now modern Turkey, Asia Minor. They even get right down, the Goths get right down and sack Athens. So they've got a long way, but most of the pressure is on this area over here, where the Franks, the Alemanni, the Jungathi were all pressing, the Saxons later, pressing on what was the province of Gaul, and the Germanies here. So real pressure, even getting down into Italy. And the 3rd century was a constant battle for the emperors, short-lived emperors, who were either being killed by their own troops or being defeated in civil war, trying to defend the empire. And this is the world that Diocletian comes into. So what was happening to the Christians during this crisis, during this 3rd century crisis? Well, what was happening was various emperors decided that the Christians were to blame for their failures, because people were turning away from the old gods, failing to do their sacrifices, and therefore it was the Christians who became the scapegoat. And in 250, Decius published an edict which was essentially a command to all the provinces to seek out the Christians and execute them. If they sacrificed the gods, they could be given a certificate, a libellus, which let them off. And here's a public sacrifice. This is going back to Marcus Aurelius, but it's a nice relief, a sculpture, which is in the Capitoline Museum, of a public sacrifice, a bull being sacrificed and everybody gathering round the temples. This is what they had to do. If they didn't, they could face execution. If they did, they got a certificate. And this is a libellus which comes from a part of Egypt, Oxyrhynchus, which is very dry, and where we get a lot of ancient papyruses from this. So here we have a real piece of evidence of someone receiving a certificate that they had sacrificed to the gods, and therefore they were not Christians, they could not be executed. However, following on from Decius, the Emperor Valerian, though we haven't got his edicts, we've got 2 letters where he's encouraging the execution of Christians. And we know that the Bishop of Carthage, Cyprian, and we know that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, Sixtus II, were executed along with their deacons. So here we've got a 6th century mosaic from Ravenna in northern Italy, and some of you, I'm sure, have been to Santa Apollinare in Nuovo. Wonderful mosaic. One of the martyrs there is holding his martyr's crown is Cyprian, and then one of his deacons, St Lawrence, of course, the famous story of St Lawrence, and this is again from Ravenna, from what is now the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, which may well have been a chapel to St Lawrence originally from the 5th century, and he was executed by being roasted on a gridiron. And you may remember the famous words where he turned to his executioner and said, "I've been cooked this side, you can turn me over now." Sense of humor to the last. So there were state totalitarian persecutions of the Christians. They were taking the blame because they were turning away from the old gods, and the emperors needed the old gods to provide success. You have to remember, in terms of the theology, the ancient gods were for the here and now. There was very little interest in the afterlife or Elysium and so on. What the gods gave you was superiority. I can't help but mention our President Trump, who is seeking re-election, because he would say the ancient gods were the winners and everybody else was a loser. So your ancient gods enabled you to be successful. And the Romans genuinely believed that thanks to Jupiter and all the pantheon of classical gods, their city was the most successful, and that is why they had an empire. It was due to the gods. So if people went against the ancient gods, turned to Christianity, they were defying the state, and defying the state meant they would be executed and got rid of. This is the world then that Diocletian comes into. Now, born Diocles, he came from Salona. There it is on the map, very near to Split, and Split will come into the story soon. And he was a soldier, came from, we understand, pretty humble parents. We don't know much about his past, but he did rise through the ranks to become commander of this very elite cavalry force, the Protectores Domestici, who were really a force that the emperor used. They were part of the emperor's bodyguard. And he was on campaigning against the Persians with the emperor Carus. And Carus died in rather mysterious circumstances, and his son, who was on the site there, Numerianus, his second son, took over, and then he died in mysterious circumstances, and Diocletian was proclaimed emperor. And because he had a strong army, and he immediately then finished the war with the Persians and marched westward, where he came into conflict with the younger son of Carus, Carinus, and you can see these characters down here. This is Carus's and Antoniani here, and then you've got Numerianus, and you see they're all wearing these radiate crowns, and then you've got over here Carinus, who was defeated by Diocletian. So Diocletian had then overthrown the previous emperors and his family, and he then started to try and bring together the empire. He found that Britannia had broken away, and a man called Carausius proclaimed himself emperor. So one of his first jobs was to bring Britain back into the empire. And he decided that the empire was so large and so difficult that he was going to create a new system whereby he would divide the emperor and the empire between several emperors. And in 287, his chief ally, another soldier called Maximian, took the title of Augustus. So they both took the title of Augustus, and they compared themselves to Jupiter, the god, the senior god of the pantheon, and to the chief hero. So it was an interesting relationship. He decided, Diocletian, that wasn't really enough, that the empire needed further governors, and so he created what was called in Greek the tetrarchy, which just means the rule of four. So he created tetrarchs. The four emperors in 293 were senior emperors, called themselves Augusti, Diocletian, who was based in Nicomedia, which you remember Nicomedia was where Pliny was writing from, over here, modern Izmit in Turkey. Maximian, who based himself in Milan in the west, here, and they had junior emperors, Caesars, to help them run their portion of the empire. Galerius was based in what's Sremska Mitrovica up here in Serbia, and Constantius Augustus was based in Treborium here, Trier, the ancient Trier. So he had this area here. So you've got Constantius with Britain and Gaul, and you've got Maximian with Spain and Italy. You've got Galerius with Greece and the Balkans here and Bulgaria. And then you've got Diocletian himself with the richest part of the empire, the eastern provinces and Egypt. Egypt very important as the grain house for Rome. And here are these characters, all presenting themselves as tough guys. This one does look a bit like Trump, I think, down here. But anyway, here's Diocletian. This comes from the museum in Istanbul. This is Maximian, we think, from Toulouse. Maximian became a damned ruler, so a lot of his stuff was just destroyed. Galerius, and this comes from Thessaloniki, and we've got Constantius from the museum in Berlin. So these are the tetrarchs, and they bring some stability to the empire. And Diocletian carries out legal reforms, military reforms, and financial reforms to try and stabilize. And we have this very intriguing sculpture, which I'm sure many of you have seen if you've been to Venice, on the corner of San Marco. And we think it comes from Egypt. It's in a very hard stone porphyry, and it shows the tetrarchs. And it's interesting, the classical form has almost been lost. They are very much a hierarchical, symbolic sculpture, the four of them, placed now around the corner of San Marco. And they got there because in 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople and brought lots of its treasures back. And when they tore away this sculpture to bring it back, they left the heel here, which turned up later and is now in the museum in Istanbul. So far, the Turkish government have not asked for the tetrarchs to be reunited with the heel. But it could go either way, couldn't it? Maybe the Italian government would ask the heel to be reunited with the tetrarchs and San Marco. Anyway, so that's, in a way, it's very symbolic. They all look the same, and they're in this hieratic pose, clutching for swords, and brotherhood. You see, they're clasping each other, they're brothers, but they do it by the sword, and they're not really human because they're not the normal classical physical shape that we would expect from classical sculpture. So the world has changed, and Diocletian has led that way. Now, we move on to this crucial bit. What was Diocletian doing with regard to Christianity? And why were his persecutions considered some of the most serious? Diocletian and Galerius decided they needed to defeat Persia to stop the continual raids. And in 298, they had a very successful war against the Persians, actually defeating the Persian king, nascent, and so comprehensive was the defeat that they captured Nasser's wife, his harem, and the treasury. And that put a stop to wars with Persia for some time. So a bit of stability was brought to the eastern provinces. But then Diocletian and Galerius, based in Antioch, were looking at their domestic policy and how to reunite the empire. And the story goes that a sacrifice failed, and they therefore blamed the Christians. Now, of course, the truth of this is very tricky, but they definitely took an idea of a policy to try and rehabilitate the ancient gods and bring back the success that the ancient gods would bring to Rome. Diocletian was, given that he wasn't from the western provinces but came from what was Dalmatia, was remarkably conservative in his attitudes. And that was one of these cases, I think, of joining the club. And because he'd been a military man, he believed in conservatism and the old gods. So it's not surprising, in a way, that the failed sacrifice was quickly blamed on the Christians. And we know that the Christians were growing in number and very powerful in the eastern provinces. Though, interestingly enough, there's a bit of evidence that suggests that the Christians weren't his first target, because in 302, an edict is published against the Manichaeans. These are the followers of Mani, a Persian prophet who proclaimed the Manichaean religion, which was still based on the old Persian religion, but was more psychological, and it was dualistic, divided between good and bad, light and dark, these forces that operated within the world. I think there's some of my students there tonight who were on my heresy course, and they may remember we talked about Mani and Manichaeism when we were talking about heresies, because St Augustine, one of the leading theologians of Western Christianity, of Catholic Christianity, of course, started his religious experience as a Manichaean and then converted to Christianity. But the first edict that Diocletian publishes in this religious sequence is against the Manichaeans. So it's later then that he moves the next year on to the Christians. Now, interestingly enough, he does a very old-fashioned thing. He decides, he and Galerius decide to seek the advice of an oracle. Now, we probably all know about the oracle in Delphi and how that was important to the Greeks, but during the Roman period, the oracles had lost some of their importance and significance, particularly in the eastern part of the empire. But there was still, in what is now modern Turkey, here, Didyma, oracle of Apollo, operating. And we're told that Diocletian sought the advice of the oracle with regards to Christians. I think probably he actually sought advice with regards to trying to re-establish the old empire. And the oracle, in its usual way, was enigmatic, but it demanded that the old gods be re-established and the new Christians be put down. So that was his first sort of move. Now, over here, I've just put this in just to show you that Manichaeanism, although it was hunted out of the Roman Empire and persecuted within the Persian Empire, they did actually survive and even extended as far as China. And our physical evidence now, and manuscript evidence of Mani and the Manichaeans, comes actually from China. Amazing, the reach. So this is 8th or 9th century element of a manuscript showing Manichaean priests. And down here is the temple, vast temple of Didyma, which some of you may have visited in your holidays and going to Turkey. So the advice of the oracle is to pursue the Christians. And from then on, we get systematic development of edicts against the Christians. I hope you're all going okay. One of the wonderful things Zoom is if you've fallen asleep, no one's noticed. If you've nipped out to get a cup of coffee or something stronger, no one's noticed. So it does have its advantages. And when you think about it, it's a horrible evening. You might not have wanted to come out tonight anyway. Now, in 303, we're told that Diocletian and Galerius burnt the church at Nicomedia. They burnt it down as a show. It almost seems a bit like Hitler and the Reichstag, because what happens next is the imperial palace gets burnt down, and who's to blame but of course the Christians. And Galerius is so concerned about what's happening in Nicomedia, we're told by a much later source, Lactantius, that he decided to go. The first edict published against the Christians from Nicomedia. Now, we're told again by Lactantius, and you can see the Christian writers here. Lactantius, who wrote the Life of the Martyrs, Eusebius wrote about the early church, and some of you will have seen his ecclesiastical history, and then Constantine himself. They all blame Galerius as the villain for the persecution of the Christians. Diocletian, it's even mentioned in Lactantius, said that the edict should be pursued but without bloodshed. So we probably shouldn't call it the Diocletianic persecution, but the Galerianus persecution. The first edict prohibited Christians from assembling for worship, and it ordered the destruction of their sculptures, which is interesting, their scriptures, their liturgical books, and their places of worship. So the churches, who at this time were quite rudimentary and often were just houses, were destroyed, and all their literature was destroyed. This is sort of classical totalitarian action, isn't it? Destroy the books, burn the books first that you don't like. And they were forbidden to petition courts, so they lost their legal rights, which was really, really difficult. And finally, any of the senior members of the court, the senators, equestrians, decurions, officers, and even veterans of the army who were found out to be Christians lost their rank. And status and hierarchy, of course, was very important in the Roman Empire, and they lost it because they were Christians. This edict obviously wasn't enough, because in the same year he publishes a second edict, and now it's getting fiercer. He orders the arrest and imprisonment of all bishops and priests. Now, you may have felt this has gone too far, because the third edict actually offers an amnesty as long as sacrifices are made to the ancient gods. So there's a bit of a compromise going on here. And we know that in the Far East, the Christians were in quite powerful positions. So there's a lot of opposition to what's going on. The fourth edict, though, is much tougher in many ways, because it's demanding a collective sacrifice, which means people can see everybody has to assemble on feast days, and if you don't sacrifice, you're seen as a Christian. And many of the magistrates use this opportunity then to execute Christians. So we see serious executions going on, the persecutions and death of Christians because of their faith. The first one, we're told, in Nicomedia was St Procopius. We don't know much about him. He's seen sometimes, as he is in this icon, as a soldier carrying a spear. Sometimes he's seen as a court official. And again, we run into problems, which I'm going to come on to, that we don't have real histories here. We have hagiographies, which are praising the saint and giving the saint all sorts of powers, but not really giving us a clear biography of the saint. The same is, of course, true of our own St. George, who's one of the early, again said to be a soldier, early victims of the Diocletianic persecution. This is a rather nice enamel from Georgia, and it shows George rescuing the empress, which is rather interesting. But of course, this is a Byzantine concept adopted by the Georgians. This particular enamel is 15th century. Diocletian himself was quite ill in 3004, and by 3005 he had decided he was going to abdicate. He is the first Roman emperor to ever abdicate in 300 years. And he then decides that if he's abdicating, so must his co-Augustus, also abdicate. So Maximian resigns as well, and he develops a promotion system. So Galerius and Constantius, who were the Caesars, become Augusti, and two new military men are named as Caesars, Severus and Maximianus. However, this is a disaster for the system. And it is this conflict which I mentioned earlier of choosing the right best person, meritocracy, as opposed to the hereditary system where you choose your son. And what happens is it very quickly falls apart because Constantius, who is campaigning at that time in Britain, dies in York. And his son, Constantine, who I put in red there because he's so important in all of this, Constantine is proclaimed emperor by the troops, no doubt. Of course, he persuaded them, no doubt, with largesse to do that. So Constantine, who was left out of the tetrarchic system, has already upset it by his troops proclaiming him emperor. And Maximian's son, Maxentius, also declares himself as emperor, and in the following year defeats the Caesar Severus and has him killed. So we're in a situation where the tetrarch is fallen apart, and two sons, Constantine and Maxentius, have claimed their hereditary right, if you like, of being emperors. This causes great consternation. And Galerius, who's in a sense now the senior Augustus, doesn't really know what to do. So he calls on Diocletian to come out of retirement. Diocletian in 305 had retired, and retired just down the road from his hometown, Salona, to what is modern Split. And he built himself a palace. This is his palace. Magnificent palace, a fortified palace in Split, which of course turned into the medieval town and the modern town of Split. And here the peristyle, where he would greet his guests, still survives. Beautiful columns of porphyry, decorations from Egypt, and Diocletian would sit here. And I'm sure many of you who've been on holiday to Split will have been here. Nice little cafe over here. And on this side, can't see it very well in this slide, he had his mausoleum built. And his mausoleum is now a cathedral church and is claimed to be the longest standing Catholic church in its original site. And there's an irony because one of Diocletian's victims, one of the Christians said to have been executed by Diocletian, is St Domnius, or Sveti Due for my Dalmatian friends who are listening, was executed by Diocletian, and the church, or rather I should say the mausoleum that was Diocletian's mausoleum, is now the church to St Dominus. And this is actually the iron gate over here to the palace. That's the gate now, and that's how it looks today, overbuilt slightly, but the gate's still there. Wonderful gate. And on the corner of the piazza there is Sveti Due. There is St Dominus overlooking. So he in the end had the last laugh over Diocletian. So Diocletian had retired, but Galerius, as I say, called him out of retirement. And they met at Carnutum in Austria, and they tried to reorganize the tetrarchy. But I think it was a bit shambolic because they still didn't understand what was going on with Maxentius and Constantine. So Galerius and a new person, Licinius, were recognized as Augustus, and Constantine and Maxentius were given the titles of Caesar. Well, they weren't happy with that, and so the whole thing fell apart in civil wars of succession. Diocletian retired and didn't come out of retirement anymore. He lived on till 311, but not in very good health, though he did, we're told, according to the sources, enjoy gardening. And he planted around the palace what has been mistranslated often as cabbages, but he planted vegetables around his palace. And interestingly enough, only other day, I was actually listening an audio book to one of Inspector Morse's inquiries, and it's mentioned right at the beginning about Diocletian looking after his vegetables. So it's a very well-known trope. So he'd retired. The civil wars broke out, and the victor of these civil wars, the main victor, was Constantine, who proved to be a very successful general indeed. He had Maximian put to death. He then fought against Maximian's son, Maxentius. And it was very important, this. Meanwhile, Galerius had issued an edict of toleration about religion, and the persecution of the Christians came to an end. Galerius died in 311 along with Diocletian. So the two old Augusti, the two people who'd been involved in initiating the persecutions, had disappeared. Constantine then, we believe, was converted to Christianity. Now, it's interesting. Constantine's mother, Helena, we're told, was the main driving force in converting him to Christianity. But there's also the story, which is repeated in several of our sources, church sources, of how before he fights Maxentius just outside Rome at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he has a dream. And in the dream, he sees in the sky the symbol of Christ. Now, in this particular manuscript, which is from the homilies of a bishop from the eastern provinces, Gregory of Nazianzus, it's a cross. But in many accounts, it's described as the Chi Rho, which of course is the Greek letters. So in the Latin, Lactantius is a cross. In other sources, it's a Chi Rho. But this is seen as significant in his conversion. It's so interesting how many of the sources, all following St. Paul really, that conversion on the road to Damascus again becomes a standard illustration of people who are converted. You may remember St. Augustine is not converted by a dream, but he's converted by a voice that he hears. So there's a sudden conversion is a sudden thing. It's a revelation, and the revelation follows on. It's a very Neoplatonic idea. Neoplotinus, following the Platonic form of philosophy, engages also with an element of revelation and mystery. So it's a mystery and a revelation. It happens to Constantine. So he's converted to Christianity. And in the following year, he publishes an edict along with Lactantius, along with Licinius, who's still ruling in the east. And this is what Lactantius says in his book on the deaths of the persecutors. This is what he says happens. When you see that this has been granted to Christians by us, your worship will know that we have also conceded to other religions the right of open and free observance of their worship for the sake of the peace of our times, that each one may have the free opportunity to worship as he pleases. This regulation is made that we may not now seem to detract from any dignity of any religion. It is a remarkable edict, following on from Galerius's. So toleration throughout the empire, and in a way was the end of the 3rd century crisis, of that instability where Christians had definitely been picked on as scapegoats because they did not conform to the old Roman idea. And now the empire is seen as much more liberal, although that liberality is going to change later on in a different way, when in fact it's the pagans that become persecuted by the 6th and 7th centuries. So the totalitarian regimes are difficult in terms of granting freedom to individuals, because those individuals will often challenge the regime in one way or another. So there's Constantine, and this is a nice bronze sculpture from his hometown of Nazus in Serbia, and where, of course, his mother also came from, Helena. Helena, extremely important in the rise of Christianity. And here she is seen, and this is a constant image in Orthodox churches of Constantine and Helena. This is from the Holy Luke Church in Greece, the monastery church, the 10th century. a rather wonderful mosaic, which some of you may have seen. And where the edict was issued from was the Palace of Milan. I'm afraid very little surviving of that palace, just the ruins. So Christianity is beginning its triumph. Perhaps it's a bit early to say from it's triumphed here, but it's the toleration of Christianity and other religions. And Constantine is going to push Christianity forward. Now, from this time onwards, we have Christian authors writing about the past and the persecutions they undertook. But what they come out with are the hagiographies. Essentially, these are stories about the martyrs. And Britain's first proto-martyr, of course, is our own St Alban. Now, the evidence about St Alban is interesting. We start with references not naming him. Our earliest source in the 4th century is Victricius, who was the Bishop of Rouen. And he talks about a martyr in Britain who is in the hands of an executioner, and he performs a miracle. He parts the river, and the river, was it the Thames or was it the Ver? Which river did he actually part? And some think that it may have been different because it may have been London that he came from, because when we get down to a later source, Gildas in a minute, you'll see he mentions the Thames. We then have also our source from the 5th century, who's writing about Germanus, and we'll see how important Germanus is, the life of Germanus, Germanus of Auxerre. And one of our major sources for St Alban is the Passio Albano, written 6th or 7th century, and it may have been written on the command of Germanus, we don't know. Germanus came to St Albans to visit the tomb, we're told, in 429. So there are real problems with the Passio Albano. The problem is we've got 6 manuscripts, roughly have been divided into 3 forms, but they don't all say the same thing, and we can't be absolutely certain of all their authenticity. So again, we've got hagiographies which refer to miracles and events, but we can't pin them down in historical terms. Then we do have someone writing the history of the period. It's the desecration and the conquest of Britain, which is Gildas, our earliest sort of historical source, not hagiographical source. And he talks about a martyr, no name mentioned, with thousands of others, he says, gathered around him. And this fits in with the story that people gathered around St Alban before he was martyred. And he opens a path across the noble River Thames. So the Thames gets mentioned here. So did St Alban come from London, or what is the situation? Or was it the Ver, and was there confusion? What we're getting in our sources here, I'm afraid, is a lot of uncertainty about what was actually St Alban's life and what happened to him. We know in the Passio that he was protecting a priest, Amphibolus, and that then he took Amphibolus's place and was executed, and then Amphibolus, of course, was executed. Very important in terms of developing the cult. Bede, much later writer, writing 7th century into the 8th century, elaborates. And interesting enough, there's this line that is given to St Albans, which is still used in the cathedral in St Albans today. I worship and adore the true and living God who created all things. So that quote from St Albans, if it happened, didn't happen anyway, is now firmly embedded in our own cathedral services. But Germanus is the key to this in many ways. Here we've got actually a sculpture of Germanus of Auxerre from a church in Paris. And Germanus seems to be on a mission to elevate St Alban, and there may be clear political reasons why he needs to do this. This is a 12th century copy of the Life of St Cuthbert from Bede. What we find with St Alban is a cult developing around St Alban and the place of St Albans. Prosper of Aquitaine, another writer in the 4th century, talks about what is happening in Britain at that time. And he says that there is a priest, Agricola, who's a Pelagian. Now, Pelagius, of course, came from Britain. He actually says the son of the Pelagian bishop, Severianus, corrupted the British churches by the insinuation of his doctrine. But at the persuasion of the deacon Palladius, Pope Celestine sent Germanus, Bishop of Auxerre, as his representative, having rejected the heretics and directed the British to the Catholic faith. So there seems to be a split. Now, some of you may not know who Pelagius was, and many of you will, but Pelagius got into a huge conflict with St Augustine. And basically, Pelagius was an optimist, and he rejected the idea of original sin and promoted the idea of free will. He thought that it was abhorrent that anyone could be born carrying the sins of their fathers or their mothers or anyone. He thought we started essentially as a blank sheet, and therefore we had a free will which took us in one direction or another. St. Augustine, you will remember, was not the creator of original sin, because that probably started with St. Paul, but he pursued that line in theology, that Adam and Eve had contaminated by concupiscence the human race, and that we were all born with original sin, and therefore it was then up to the grace of God as to whether we would be saved or not saved. So there was this conflict, and in the end it was St. Augustine's view that dominated and became the tenet of the church. So what looks like is happening, and it's perhaps not surprising that because Pelagius came from Britain, that there is a group in Britain who are still pursuing the Pelagian line. And Germanus is sent over to Britain to sort this out. Now, how much did he know about St Alban before he came? What was available to him, and what was then his purpose? The sources are slightly different. What we are told is that he returned to the continent, to Auxerre, with some soil with the blood of St Albans in the soil. So he'd already got a relic. He was taking a relic back, and as we know, of course, the shoulder bone, of course, of St Alban also travels at some point to Cologne, and then, of course, has come back to us here in St Alban. So the whole cult of St Albans is becoming very important, and it looks like it's being used here for political purposes to ensure that the British don't follow the Pelagian line, that they are tied into the Catholic Church. And of course, this also is a universal church at this time. So although we've got an Orthodox icon and we might identify that as separate from the Catholic Church, at this period, those churches had not split and were united. Much later on, of course, from the sources, mainly from the Passio, but we also get the elaboration through the manuscripts, and we've got the life of St Albans, Matthew Paris's life of St Albans, where the miracles are given great prominence. So we know that when St Alban was led off to execution, the first executioner refused to do it and became converted, and he himself was executed. The second executioner executed St Alban, but his eyes fell out, and St Alban's head, depending on your story, but may have rolled down the hill, which suggests the cathedral, abbey site, is where he was executed, or maybe not, and a spring grew up. We certainly know in the medieval period the holy water was very important, and as many of you will know, I live on Sopwell Lane, and Sopwell Lane got its name from the sops that the nuns would give the pilgrims, would offer to the pilgrims who had to pay for it, sops from the holy well, bread dipped into that holy water, which obviously had miraculous powers. So St Alban became very powerful and very important as a cult, and we know about the pilgrims and the power of the Abbey of St Alban. So that cult and how that developed was crucial to the early church, and in its ways it picks up the whole focus of the early church at this period on martyrdom and how important martyrdom was. the whole concept of martyrdom. Now, we have real problems with St Albans, not just in terms of understanding the reality of him, and there are still some historians who don't even believe he existed, but also if he was a martyr, when was he a martyr? Because again, our sources are imprecise. Now, we do know that Severus campaigned in Britain, and in the Passio Albano, there is a point where it talks about him being delivered up and killed by the impious Caesar. Now, there is an argument about whether Severus here means the emperor or whether, in fact, it's used as an adjective. So there's a debate about that particular manuscript, and all the 6 manuscripts that we've got, none of them are clear. So we've got a problem. It could have been the Emperor Severus back in the 3rd century, which, because the emperor was here, is quite possible, again, picking on a scapegoat or on local Christians, because the pagans or the more traditional worshippers have found them intolerable. That may have been the case. Of course, we know there was a major persecution under the 2 emperors, Decius and Valerian, and Decius had an edict which was empire-wide, and Valerian probably was the same, although we only have his letters. It's probably the same, that it was an edict that went right. So it could have been in the 3rd century under Decius or Valerian. It might even have been under Carinus, because there's evidence in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles that it was during the time of Carinus. So it could have been him. And finally, of course, Bede tells us that it was under Diocletian. Though Diocletian didn't travel to Britain, Constantius was in the West, and all the evidence we have about Constantius, and it may of course been that Constantius was slightly whitewashed because of course he was the father, Constantine, but the evidence we have is the edicts that were promulgated in the East under Diocletian and Galerius were ignored in the West. So it's unlikely that Diocletian was actually responsible for the persecution and execution of St Alban. So what are we left with? I've just put the nice stained glass of the execution, the traditional view of the execution with the spring and the soldier, and of course what the cathedral church looked like. This cult became so powerful and so important that it put the monastery and St Alban on the map. However, let's go back now and just revise what we think about the causes of the persecution and the likelihood. What were the causes? Well, I talked about the ideology of the Roman Empire. It's polytheistic, it's very hierarchical, and it's very elitist. There's a hierarchy, right from the emperor down the classes. One of the things that is odd, and it's a sort of paradox in the Roman Empire, is that it was incredibly elitist, so everybody knew their place, but there was enormous social mobility. So we see in the 3rd century, for example, a slave, the grandson of a slave becoming an emperor. So people could move around, and we've got lots of monuments erected by freedmen, people who had been slave but freed and then made money and showing off their status. So it was very hierarchical, but there was a lot of social mobility. But politically, it was autocratic and absolutism in that sense. And you had to obey that system and the emperor. And it was very coercive. If you didn't, then you faced execution. And life was relatively very cheap during the ancient world. So execution and some horrific types of execution would take place, like the crucifixion of Jesus. So it was a totalitarian regime. And to hold the empire together, there were certain elements of loyalty which were enforced upon you in the same way that we know in all totalitarian regimes, you are forced to be there. And again, you can think of North Korea and the parades and the clapping and the kowtowing to the Kims, how that operated. Now, what about Christianity itself? How did it operate in this? Well, it was monotheistic, so it had to deny the polytheism of the ancient gods. It was egalitarian and very egalitarian at the beginning. And of course, there are big debates about the hierarchy of the church. And some of the heretics would reject the idea of bishops and deacons. And I showed you that wall painting from the Catechumen Priscilla, where probably it reflects the idea that men and women were equal in the church then, before hierarchy was imposed. And it was universal. Paul had taken Christianity to the Gentiles. So unlike Judaism, though it was monotheistic, was restricted to a particular ethnic group, and Rome could cope with that, this was dangerous. Egalitarianism, where slaves were seen as having equal position under God with the rulers, was very tricky for the Romans. And it was spreading. It was spreading everywhere, and it promulgated peace, and it undermined the militaristic elements of the Roman Empire. It was theocratic. So God was in charge and not the emperor, which again, for the secular forces, made problems. Christians thought nothing of death because they were going to be received into heaven. It was soteriological. Soterial just meaning the idea of saving, savior. So you went to heaven and you were saved, and you were on an equal status with anybody else there. So that egalitarianism again undermined the idea of the Roman Empire. And finally, very important, as we've seen now, emerging from all of this, the dominant religion in the Roman world, then all the hagiographies start emerging. The martyrs become focuses of attention, and it's that quite fundamentalist element of religion which becomes so powerful. And their reliquaries, their miracles, all of those become celebrated in what we could describe as the cult of the martyrs. So that's very powerful for Christianity, but of course at the same time made it very vulnerable to the Roman Empire. What Constantine did was, of course, in the end, bring Christianity into being the state religion, and then the Christians had the power and the totalitarianism, and someone like the Emperor Justinian, operating in the 6th century, our sources, Procopius tells us, eliminated at least 50,000 pagans, executed them for being pagans. So the boot, they went on the other foot. But equally, it became quite totalitarian. So what is our verdict about Diocletian? What is the verdict? Well, he certainly did kill Christians, guilty. But did he kill St Albans? Not proven. Thank you very much.
Tim, thank you so much. I wonder if you can stop the screen share for us for a second.
I will do. Just need to get rid of it.
I think I've overridden you. Sorry.
No, you've done it. Oh, well done. Well done. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
No, that's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Tim. I cannot imagine how you possibly remembered all of those names and talked with barely drawing breath for almost 90 minutes. That's been absolutely brilliant.
Well, I've got the slides as a nice prompt, haven't I?
Well, I'm quite bowled over. I'm sure everybody else is. I'm just going to ask everybody to unmute themselves just for a couple of seconds to join me in showing your appreciation for Professor Tim Boson with a round of applause. All unmute and just join me for a second.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very strange always talking to muted, because and the risk, it's this risk when you try and crack a joke, you're not quite sure if it's worked or not because you've got no feedback.
I'm just going to put people on mute again. Tim, you'll have to unmute yourself if that's all right. I know it's 1 minute to 9, which is technically when I have to let you all go, but it would be lovely just to have a couple of moments to ask Tim a couple of questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please do write it into the chat box. You'll find it probably at the bottom of your screen, might be down the side or hidden under more. And you can type your question in, and I will ask just a few because I don't want to keep you too long from either the coverage of the US election or perhaps for some of you from Bake Off. So please do send in your questions. I've got a couple already. We've got a question about persecution of other religions. I know you mentioned Manichaeans at one point. Were there other religions which did not favour the old gods or the emperor worship? Somebody's mentioned Mithraism, for example. Was it mainly Christians who bore the brunt of that sort of anti-Roman religion, or were there others who also faced persecution?
It's interesting. I mean, I talked about the Manichaeans, and what I didn't say, which of course one of the things why they were persecuted was also because it came from Persia, and that they were the deadly enemies of Rome. So you're not bringing nasty Persian habits into the Roman Empire. No, I mean something like Mithraism, which of course also came from Persia and was very popular with the Roman soldiers. And of course, there was a Mithraeum in London, which you can go and see now. Actually, it's brilliant. It's beautifully presented. And of course, on Hadrian's Wall, Mithraism wasn't, although it had very clear stages and was quite cultish in a way, it didn't deny the other gods. It just ignored them. But it didn't matter. It wasn't so monotheistic. The problem for Christians was they kept on saying there is only one God. Get all these ancient gods out of the way, forget them. And it's the one God, and that's the one God. So generally the Romans tolerated all sorts of religions because they just absorbed them. And said, oh, that's a bit like Apollo, or that's a bit like Jupiter, or that's a bit like Venus. We'll just bundle them up. And that's so that's how they got round it. The most important thing was, particularly up until the end of the 3rd century, you must be able to go to the imperial cult and worship the emperor. It's the deification of the emperor, because Christians couldn't do that, because that would be very much against their religion. So that left them caught out. Whereas other local religions, it just didn't matter because they were used to being polytheistic. They were used to it's another god. It doesn't really matter. He's another god. Doesn't really matter. So yes, the Christians bore the brunt of the persecutions because they were so determined about monotheism.
And a follow-up from that then, might the persecution of Christians have also been useful in showing non-Christians the importance of obedience to the emperor?
Well, all the time, that's a very good question, because all the time obedience to the state is being demanded. Because this is a huge empire made up of, I don't know how many different ethnic groups. So how do you hold that together? China's got the same problem now. And now I used to go to China quite regularly on business, and the university people would always tell me that the Chinese government is terrified of China splitting up, because you look from the outside world, you think China is homogenous, but it's not. It's got 92 different languages, and this is why the Uyghurs are such a threat, because their ideology, their theology, trumps the Communist Party. Muhammad, Islam is more important than communism, so that's a real threat to them.
Thank you. I've got one comment as much as a question, but you might be able to shed some light on this. Somebody was fascinated by the sort of cartwheel version of the ichthus, which you showed us, which this person says is on several of the steps of the Temple of Apollo at Didyma, alongside some other Christian carvings, and surrounded by a dozen cubes, which possibly represent the 12 apostles. That fusion of very overtly Christian in a sort of pagan context. Can you say any more about that?
Well, because what does happen inevitably with the triumph of Christianity is you see pagan temples sometimes converted into churches, and of course that happened to the most famous on the Acropolis. So you can see that happen, but also I think, and it's the same with the one I showed at Ephesus. Christians in a sense, when they were coexisting with paganism, were also, leaving their graffiti, because they were the right religion and the pagans were wrong, and they turned out to be right in the end.
And I think probably our final question, I'm sorry we're not going to have time to ask all of them. One final one, a controversial one. It's come up a few times at various talks here. Why was St George, who you showed us a marvellous image of earlier, why was St George chosen as patron saint of England and not St Alban?
Well, it's interesting that, isn't it? I think it's really St Alban. I think what you've got, we know that St George comes back with the Crusaders. So he's discovered in what is now Turkey by the Crusaders. They adopt him, he's a military saint, and they bring him back. And I think it's the regime. You see, what you've got there, you've got powerful monastery, yes, but the sovereign, and we might say, take Richard I or whatever, they're operating against the church. There's a constant conflict between ecclesiastical law and secular law between those. So the army has the say in the end. So I think it's really the army that the Crusaders want, and we can say it was Richard, but I think it was probably slightly before Richard, adopt St George because he reflects their view and not the ecclesiastical monastic one. And it just in the way that, St Albans, the city here, a town as it was always in conflict with the monastery. When the peasants revolt, who were the first people at the gate of the monastery? Well, were the citizens of St Albans. And then, of course, in defiance, they build the clock tower in the 15th century. The monastery doesn't want them to have the clock tower, but it's their gesture of defiance against the monastery. So there was always that sort of conflict. So I suspect that is why St George was so convenient, brought back by the army, suited the sovereign and the court rather than the ecclesiastical authorities. Because I'm sure, yes, St Alban's got a much greater claim to be the patron saint. And Alban itself, I mean, the name, it could be a made-up name because it represents the British. It's as it was called, Albanus.
On that note, I'm going to say a huge thank you to Professor Tim Boson for engaging us, entertaining us, filling us with facts for the evening. It's been brilliant as ever, Tim. Thank you so much. Hugely.
Thank you for organising it, Caroline, and thanks everyone for attending and supporting the cathedral and supporting Conservation 50. Thanks very much, all of you.
Absolutely. Before you go, though, just a couple of notices. It's never a proper talk without a few adverts at the end. Thank you, as Tim has said, for supporting us and Conservation 50. Please email me if you'd like to be added to our mailing list to hear about new events coming up. As you will all undoubtedly know, we've got the presidential elections going on at the moment. We're going to be joined by Sir Vincent Feen, who was the former British consul to Jerusalem, next week to talk about what the impact of the outcome of that election is going to be on the Holy Land. That's going to be really interesting, really topical. Sir Vincent is an absolutely brilliant speaker, so do come and join us for that. On Thursday, we've got a talk on fake news, not in any way related, obviously, to the presidential elections whatsoever, but we'll be looking at truth and post-truth and how to combat a pandemic of false and disinformation. Tomorrow we've got a course starting on Christian radicalism and the hope of a world transformed, which is going to be fascinating. So if you enjoy a bit of church history, that'll be absolutely brilliant. And more history coming up, Women in the Tower of London in a couple of weeks' time. So please do join us for that. And if you're interested in local history, the St Albans and Herts Archaeological and Architectural Society have a great programme out as well. You can look on their website or on our learning pages to see a copy of that. That is all from me. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much to Tim. Apologies that we've run over a little bit. It's been brilliant this evening. Thank you very, very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.